Welcome to our digital BSL signed tour of two of Edinburgh's most iconic landmarks, the Scott and Nelson monuments. Both monuments command presence in the city of Edinburgh and dominate the skyline. And both are in the care of Museums and Galleries Edinburgh. First, we're going to take you on a tour around the Scott Monument. The Scott Monument stands centre stage on Edinburgh's Princes Street. Grand and imposing, this Victorian structure greets travellers from Waverley Station and acts as a beacon to all those in the surrounding central area. This Victorian image is by early photographer Thomas Vernon Begbie and shows Princes Street and the Scott Monument from Register House and was photographed around 1857. This is a glass negative from the Thomas Begbie Cavai collection. Which is held by City of Edinburgh Museums and Galleries. As Waverley itself derives its name from the novels of Sir Walter Scott, you do not need to travel far to see the resounding influence of the 19th century writer. When Walter Scott passed away, the nation of Scotland found itself in mourning. Scott was one of the most popular writers in Scotland's history. And after his passing, a decision was made to erect the monument in his honour. This structure would recognise the achievement of Scott as a man, but it would also be a celebration of his literary work, with statues depicting various characters from his novels decorating the niches of the stonework. There are 68 statues adorning the outside of the Scott Monument, and an additional 2 on the ground level, at the centre of Walter Scott himself and his dog Maida, sculpted by Sir John Steele from Carrara marble. The story is that when the large marble block arrived at the docks of Leith from Italy, it weighed more than 30 tonnes and was so heavy that the mechanical device used to lift it snapped under the weight and it dropped into the sea. For the structure itself, a competition was held to find an architect who could encompass all the attributes into one grandiose formation. With many entries far and wide, a decision was made to appoint a gentleman by the name of George Meikle Kemp as the lead designer. This decision was not easily reached, however, as Kemp had entered the competition under the pseudonym of John Morveau. A reference to the French mason who had contributed to the design of Melrose Abbey. Kemp's design for the Scott Monument had been heavily influenced by Melrose Abbey. With intricate spires and the tiniest of detail included in every inch. But his lack of practical experience is something still debated today. Kemp had not been formally trained as an architect, but was a skilled illustrator and had spent a portion of his life as a cabinet maker, of which his products had been well received. It's generally agreed upon that Kemp had an expert knowledge of Gothic architecture, as he'd spent so much time studying various religious buildings in Scotland, England, France and Belgium. When Morveau was revealed to be Kemp, there was considerable outrage. He was rejected by the two other architects who'd placed in the top 3 of the competition, as they did not consider Kemp to be a recognised architect. The judges could not decide on a winner, and so asked for more submissions, to which Kemp put forward an improved version of his monument, with even more intricacy and homage to Melrose Abbey. It was only then that Kemp was declared the winner. The foundation stone of the Scott Monument was laid on the 15th of August 1840. A silver trowel was used to commemorate the laying of the foundation stone. And is situated within the Scott Monument to this day. The construction of the monument lasted a total of 4 years before its completion. These 2 images show an extraordinary record of its construction. This extraordinary photo shows the stonemasons at work. Unfortunately, Kemp was not around to see the finished structure, as he'd succumbed to a fatal accident. In early 1844, a thick fog had clouded Edinburgh, and Kemp was alleged to have become disorientated. Whilst around the old canal basin, it's thought that he fell into the canal and drowned. His body was recovered from the water shortly after. Nevertheless, construction continued on the monument. William Bonar, who was Kemp's brother-in-law, supervised the project for the remainder of the build. And he even managed to amend the monument to be even taller than its original design. The completed Scott Monument stands at 200 feet and 6 inches, the peak of which is reached at 287 steps. This photograph shows the newly completed monument with its commanding place in Princes Street, Edinburgh. There is great debate over when exactly the inauguration ceremony was held, but it's believed to be either the 15th, 17th or 18th of August 1846, and saw huge crowds come to pay homage to both writer and architect. It attracted visitors from across the country. And even today, we still get visitors coming from abroad to see the monument because of their enthusiasm for Scott's writings. Others come for the inspiring panorama of Edinburgh's skyline, which the upper levels of the monument afford. These 4 extraordinary watercolours are in our care and were painted by an artist called Joseph Ebsworth. And were completed in the year 1847, painted from the Scott Monument shortly after it opened. They give an accurate picture of how Edinburgh looked at this time, with views from each direction. There are 4 upper levels of the Scott Monument, all accessed via turnpike staircases embedded in the stonework. On the first level, there's a small sanctuary dedicated to Scott, with beautiful stained glass windows and delicately carved wooden panels. Similar to the exterior facade of the monument, these carvings relate to the writings of Scott and feature the names of his prominent works. It can be quite calm in this room, safe from the elements. But once stepping outside, Edinburgh takes the spotlight as the all-encompassing views show off the city's beauty. The Scott Monument lies in a fascinating area of Edinburgh, as the views from up high really showcase the difference between the old and new town. The old town is pictured here, and is essentially a jigsaw of differing time periods. Although some buildings still exist from the 17th century and earlier, much of the old town is made up of 19th century Victorian redevelopments. The High Street, which is in the upper section of the Royal Mile, was almost entirely demolished in favour of these upgrades. The irony is that the majority of the old town is now newer than the new town. Running down the sides of Castle Hill and the High Street were tiny alleyways, or closes, that continued down to a man-made body of water known as the Nor Loch, or North Lake. This was designed as a northern protection of the city. the remainder of which was located behind several walls. Drained in stages, but completely eradicated by 1820, this now houses the main train station of Edinburgh, Waverley Station. As previously stated, the station was named after Scott's Waverley novels and shows that his influence far outlasted his lifetime. In the 1760s, it was decided that the new town should be built on the northern side to provide a more modern and tasteful development for the wealthier to escape the overcrowding and the steady decline of the city. The designs for the plan were submitted by a stonemason named James Craig, who was 27 years old when he put forward his plans. The original design was meant to be shaped like a Union Jack to symbolise the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom had officially existed since the Acts of Union in 1707. But after decades of rebellion from Stuart loyalists against a Hanoverian monarch, the city plan was meant as an act of appeasement to show the cooperation that can exist between nations. The plans were changed, however. Two streets that run parallel were given names to still show this union. And those were Rose Street, to symbolise England, and Thistle Street, to symbolise Scotland. Many other streets and squares in the new town adopted titles relevant to English monarchical heritage, as the Lord Provost at the time, George Drummond, was keen to show Scotland's support of the Union. Nowadays, most visitors to the Scott Monument know very little of its history, or of the area it casts its shadow upon. But with a dominating height and presence, it's known by anyone who sets foot in Edinburgh. If you were to arrive within the city from Edinburgh Waverley, you're greeted by Walter Scott's legacy from the railway to the skies. And the monument stands as a beacon to unite, once and for all, the old and the new. Now, we turn our attention to our second monument, the Nelson Monument. The Nelson Monument stands on top of Edinburgh's Calton Hill, overlooking the city beneath from its rocky berth on the eastern side. It was built between 1807 and 1816. For the last 2 centuries, it has stood in quiet majesty with an eye on Edinburgh, but also facing outwards to the sea and to those who journey and work upon it. This early engraving of it shows how it looked in around 1829. The Nelson Monument occupies an area that was once thought to represent Edinburgh as the Athens of the North. Alongside the unfinished Parthenon and the observatory. Along with these other buildings, the Nelson Monument was to showcase the Scottish Enlightenment and the importance of Edinburgh within this movement. However, many are still unaware of the intentions behind the monument, or of the circumstances that led to its construction and subsequent additions. The monument takes its name from Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson, though it was never intended to be a memorial or a celebration. Its intention was to inspire those who saw it to seek the same qualities which Nelson displayed in themselves. But also to serve as a strong reminder of what a nation may demand of its people. Nelson is seen by many as one of the greatest naval commanders of all time, with an impressive line of victories. Known for his bravery, his career had progressed significantly due to his contributions during minor battles that occurred as a direct result of the French Revolution. And he had already gained notoriety as a highly skilled naval tactician by the time of the Napoleonic Wars. This did not come without great personal cost, for in the line of duty he sustained many injuries, including partial loss of sight in his right eye and losing his right arm entirely. Nelson commanded the British fleet on many occasions during the Napoleonic Wars. But it was his decisive victory at the Battle of Trafalgar that truly cemented his reputation. The Battle of Trafalgar took place on the 21st of October 1805 near the coast of Cape Trafalgar in Cadiz, Spain. The British fleet was headed by Admiral Nelson aboard the HMS Victory, and his Vice Admiral, Cuthbert Collingwood, with the French and Spanish fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve and Admiral Federico Gravina. Nelson's tactic was to sail head-on against the Franco-Spanish fleet to break their defensive line. This was somewhat of a gamble, as it meant they were unable to fire upon the opposing fleet, but themselves subjected to enemy fire. Luckily, the opposition were composed of inexperienced seamen, and Nelson was able to cut through the defensive line and surround the middle third of the fleet. Despite receiving heavy fire, the British fleet won the battle with an overwhelming victory, sustaining no loss of ships. Unfortunately, the biggest casualty of the battle was Nelson himself. He was hit by a musket ball and was fatally wounded, with his last words recorded to be, "God and my country." Nowadays, we often mark the battle and deck the monument in flags. The original design of the Nelson Monument was submitted by Alexander Naismith. And was reminiscent of a pagoda-style structure blended with a lighthouse. This idea was eventually deviated from, as it would be considerably expensive, and so plans by the architect Robert Byrne were chosen. These plans shaped the monument so that it resembled a telescope, with the eyepiece facing towards the sky. The construction began in 1807 and quickly developed, with the telescope section of the building almost complete when funding ran out. The base of the structure was not actually completed until 1816 by Thomas Bonar, as Byrne had died shortly before. The building has 143 steps to take visitors up to a viewing platform at the top, where breathtaking views of Edinburgh and the North Sea can be observed. Its position on the crest of Calton Hill also served a functional purpose to the ships in Leith Harbour, as it acted as a signal tower, but the real value of such a thing would not be fully realised until many decades later. In 1853, the tower received a very important addition. A time ball was installed on the very top level of the monument, to act as a signal to the ships at harbour, and is still operated to this day. The time ball is made up of wood with a layer of zinc around it, and it is centred on the mast at the peak of the building. It sits on top of the roof until 1 p.m. approaches, at which time it is manually raised to the top of the mast and dropped down at the precise moment it turns 1 o'clock. This simple action was important for sailors at harbour to know the exact time to set their chronometers. The ship's chronometers were used to determine longitude by comparing the time and location of the vessel, and so precision was key to their functioning correctly. One of the issues with the time ball was that sometimes there's a prevalence of fog and mist in Edinburgh, particularly on Calton Hill, and from a distance it could be completely obscured. The way this issue was dealt with was that later in 1861 an audible signal was added should the time ball be non-visible. This is known today as the 1 o'clock gun, and is a blank shell fired from a cannon on the Half Moon Battery at Edinburgh Castle. Calton Hill has its connection with the sea, as stated, but it was also closely connected with the sky, as the time ball's very inception came from the mind of an astronomer. Charles Piazzi Smyth was the director of the Royal Observatory, or Astronomer Royal for Scotland. From 1846 to 1888. He was a keen believer that the tops of hills and mountains were the best places to view the sky and make observations. The observatory on Calton Hill was used through funding supplied by government grants, and Charles Piazzi Smyth used the site enthusiastically and even helped publish much of the data that his predecessor had left. Smyth would be notably involved in the controversial research surrounding the Great Pyramids of Giza, which he believed could prove the existence of God, known by him as pyramidology. Despite this, he was still very well respected. The government eventually decided that funding of the observatory was to cease, and this is said to have contributed to Smyth's resignation. Ironically, after Smyth had left, a benefactor by the name of Lord Crawford donated much of his materials on the basis that the government would continue to support the observatory. Charles Piazzi Smyth left behind his legacy of the Nelson Monument time ball and the 1 o'clock gun, both of which are still in use to this day. Calton Hill has served many purposes, and the Nelson Monument unites the sea and land of Edinburgh with the wider world. Today, it may not have purpose as essential as it once was, but it symbolises aspiration and greatness. Whether that be valour, brave curiosity, or the pursuit of knowledge. The inscription above the door of the Nelson Monument reads, "To the memory of Vice Admiral Horatio Lord Viscount Nelson, and of the great victory of Trafalgar. Too dearly purchased with his blood. The grateful citizens of Edinburgh have erected this monument, not to express their unavailing sorrow for his death, nor yet to celebrate the matchless glories of his life, but, by his noble example, to teach their sons to emulate what they admire. And, like him, when duty requires it, to die for their country." Dramatic though this is, the Nelson Monument represents not martyrdom, as the inscription suggests, but a call to better ourselves and for courage to face the future. Visit the Nelson Monument to see breathtaking views over the city of Edinburgh and over the River Forth to Fife. We hope you enjoyed this tour of our monuments. For further information about our venues, exhibitions and events, visit our website edinburghmuseums.org.uk. Follow us on X at EdinCulture. Instagram, Museums and Galleries Edinburgh. Or on our 3 Facebook pages, City Art Centre, Lauriston Castle, and Museums and Galleries Edinburgh. Additional photography, Greg McVean, 2022. Produced by Magic Egg Productions.